Good morning. Did I get that on? I think so. Do we have a little more light? I have very old eyes. Oh, perfect. That helps my very old eyes a great deal. It's hard to have to make that confession here, but great to be back with you again this week, and we're going to continue talking about this idea of becoming a force of heaven. And the first week I shared with you some lessons that children had learned, and I love to hear the things that the children think about God. And so there was many years ago, I think in the 60s, a couple of authors wrote a book called Children's Letters to God, and then they've updated it through the years since then. I just wanted to share with you a couple of those letters as we begin today. This is Maria. She writes to God, "Dear God, do you get your angels to do all the work? Mommy says we are her angels and we have to do everything." Dear God, this is Anita. "Dear God, is it true my father won't get into heaven if he uses his bowling words in the house?" That's an important question, I guess, right? Here we go. Barbara. "Dear God, do good people have to die young? I heard my mommy say that. P.S. I'm not always good." Hedging her bets a little bit there, right? Dear God, Joyce says, "Thank you for the baby brother, but what I prayed for was a puppy." So I'd like to get message to the Heavenly Complaint Department on that one. And then maybe my favorite of all times, this is Larry. "Dear God, maybe Cain and Abel wouldn't kill each other so much." I like that idea, not kill each other so much if they had their own rooms. It works for me and my brother. So there's a great kid. He's going to give the Almighty some parenting advice there. I think if we could write letters to God, we'd be asking questions, I think a lot of us, about this thing we've been talking about the last few weeks, about how we are to become a force of heaven, how it's true daily in our lives that, as Peter says, we become participants in the divine nature. And as the Apostle Paul said, that we are transformed day by day into Jesus' likeness with ever-increasing glory. We might have some questions about just how does that work in our lives. And today, there were about 10 different things I wanted to share with you today as we sort of wrap this up, because this is a lot shorter than I'd like to do on this issue of becoming a force of heaven. But today I thought, let's talk about the idea of impact and our lives having impact, and especially this passage we just read, because I think it puzzles us often when we come across this salt and light passage. And so I want to talk about that idea of our lives being lives of impact and raising our IQ, our impact quotient. During World War II, Britain's Queen Mary, she participated in the effort to gather scrap for the war effort. And this would drive her attendants crazy, because every day when she'd go out on her walk, she'd drag back all kinds of junk. They'd be loaded down with junk that she was bringing back to be recycled for the war effort. But she was really dedicated to this purpose. And one day she came back, and a few of her attendants are straining, dragging behind them this rusty piece of iron. And she gets it back to the castle. She comes triumphantly with this great piece of scrap that she's gathered on her walk. And pretty soon a page comes with this message. "Please, Your Majesty, a Mr. Hodge has arrived at the palace, and he says Your Majesty has taken his plow, and he would like Your Majesty to graciously give it back to him at once, since he can't get on without it." Now, I like her spirit, right? She's going to make an impact. She's going to do something for the war effort. But just think about the neighbors. They'd say, you can't leave anything in your yard because the queen will drag it away and back to the palace, and they'll junk it. But I do love the spirit, right? Because Queen Mary said, I'm going to make a difference. My life is going to have an impact. I'm going to be involved in this. And that's what we want our lives to be, right? We hear those words. We think of the idea, me, you, as a force of heaven, a place where heaven comes to earth every day, right where we stand. And heaven speaks where we speak. And all those sorts of things we've talked about, and how we become participants in that nature and transformed into his likeness. But we want to talk about the aspect of that impact today, and especially in light of this passage here. I think you have it on your sheets, and it will probably be up here on the screen. Again, you know I don't like to read alone, so let's read it together. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can one be made It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. So I want to talk about three things about living a life of impact. Number one, the first here is that God has designed me for a life of significant impact. That is God's design. That is his plan. We talked about dreaming his dreams. Well, that's God's dream for you, that your life would have a significant impact. Now here, every time we open the Gospels, I don't want you, remind yourself of this. Don't think this is what Jesus would say if he was here. Say this. This is what Jesus is saying because he is here, right? That's what the Gospels are about. This is what Jesus is saying today because Jesus is here. And so we notice that first part of the passage, Matthew 5:13, you're the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. Circle on your sheet that first word, you. You. That little pronoun you in the Greek is in the emphatic tense, which is like taking a red pen and underlining it 5 times. He's saying you. No, I mean you. I'm talking to you. You are the salt of the earth. Now notice he doesn't say you might become the salt of the earth. With a little practice and a little training, hey, someday, who knows, you could actually be the salt of the earth. He doesn't say you carry the salt of the earth. He doesn't say you dispense the salt of the earth. What does he say? You are. That's what he says. You are the salt of the earth. The supernatural power and presence and purpose of God indwells you. You are now the salt of the earth. Now, there are many uses for salt. You probably have heard people talk sermons about salt before, but there's 3 we want to talk about today. 3 things that were important to people in Jesus' day, in New Testament times. 3 things that salt was used for. Number 1, the first one, salt preserves. Bear in mind, in the Middle East, there was no refrigeration, there was no ice, there was no way to keep and preserve food. In the little nation state of Israel, fishing was a backbone industry for that little nation state, and they would catch fish in the Sea of Galilee and then have to ship it to important busy ports or markets in Jerusalem. Well, how to get it from the Sea of Galilee to Jerusalem? You had to pack it in salt, because salt inhibits decay and corruption. Now, I would suggest that the world you woke up to today is full of some decay and corruption. Wouldn't you say so? You can't open a newspaper, you can't listen to a news report without thinking, wow, this is painfully obvious. There is a tremendous amount of decay and corruption. The unthinkable is now the lead on the news stories every night. Isn't that true? Things you could never imagine are now the things they're talking about on the news story. And see, it's God's intention that we be a people who purify, who preserve, and in a society filled with corruption and decay, that we stop that process, that we be a people who stand against those things. I remember once when I was at Stanford, Chuck Colson came, and if you remember, Charles Colson was a special assistant to Richard Nixon, went to prison for his part in the Watergate scandal, and then later in prison turned to faith and started a ministry called Prison Fellowship, which now works all over the world in prisons. And Colson came and shared with us one day about a woman that he had met. She was a single mom in Chicago, and she worked hard overtime to take care of her kids, struggled just to keep food on the table. He came and spoke about the needs of prisoners, and she said, I want to do something, but I don't have a penny. I mean, every penny I have goes to feed my kids. I don't really have time. I have to work overtime to take care of my kids. But then she thought, I have my lunch hour. I have that, and I can give my lunch hour. And what I will do is pray for and write letters to prisoners during my lunch hour. And she literally did this every day for several years. And by the time Colston spoke to us at Stanford, he said, I followed this woman's path and the people she had written to, and the best we can determine, her letters and encouragement and prayers have had an impact on the lives of over 5,000 prisoners. People whose lives have been revolutionized, who've come to faith, who share that faith with others, who are changing their communities, and it's reaching around the world. There's a woman who took seriously the words of Jesus when he said, you, I mean you are the salt of the earth. And she played that role of preserving and purifying, preserving in her world. Second thing, salt not only preserves, it also, secondly, purifies, what I just said, right? It is used medicinally in the New Testament. It was used to treat and to clean wounds. And it's God's intention that we be like that too, right? That we be ones who are an extension of his healing touch. That when people come in contact with us, they come in contact with God's forgiveness. They come in contact with God's love. They come in contact with his healing and his mercy and his compassion. Because that's what salt does. So it preserves and purifies. And number three, the third one, it produces thirst. Salt produces thirst in others. Now, if you don't believe me, ask any bartender why they have peanuts and pretzels on every bar. Or so I'm told, right? I don't really know. I don't know that firsthand, but I'm told they're there on those bars, right? And if you ask them why, they'll tell you because it makes people thirsty and they want to drink more. Super Bowl 11, the Oakland Raiders played against the Minnesota Vikings, and I still remember not the Super Bowl so much, but I remember the interviews afterwards. And there was a Christian on the Oakland Raiders team, Dave Rowe, and he prayed before the Super Bowl, God, I just pray you'll give me an opportunity to speak out for you, because I will. If you give me the chance, I'll speak out for you at the Super Bowl. So the reporters interviewed 3 people after the Super Bowl, and guess who one of them was? Dave Rowe. So the reporter goes up to Dave Rowe and he says, Dave, this must be the most exciting day of your life. And Dave Rowe said, no, actually it isn't. And the guy was shocked. He didn't know what to say. He was speechless for a moment. And when he finally recovered, he said to him, oh, really, Dave? It really isn't? He goes, no, it's not at all. In fact, I wouldn't even put this day in my top 50. And he says, well, how is that possible? That winning the Super Bowl is not one of your top 50 days. And he goes, well, let me tell you. And then he starts preaching, right? And I still remember the scene. He's preaching there, and the guy keeps trying to grab the microphone away from him and take it away, but he won't stop. He just keeps telling him about Jesus' love and how it's revolutionized his life and how that's everything. And that's what I care about. It's made me a great family person. It's done this in my life. And he won't shut up. And my image is still there of this guy trying to drag the microphone out of his hand. Well, something happened during that off season. There was like a revival that swept through the Oakland Raiders of all teams, right? Being a 49ers fan, I'm not thinking much of the Raiders, but a revival swept through the team. A lot of those players came to faith. And when they asked him later, why did you do that? They said, it was him on TV. Because I looked at his life and said, I got to have that. That's what I need in my life. I need some of that. They were thirsty, right? Because that's what salt does. So the scripture says, you are the salt of the earth, and salt preserves and it purifies and it produces thirst. But notice that the passage says, but if the salt loses its saltiness, that's what it says, right? Loses its saltiness. The word in Greek is maranthe. Maranthe. We get our word moron from that, right? What do you think that means? If the salt becomes moronic, if it becomes useless, if it becomes ridiculous, if it becomes so empty, so foolish, then what good is it? It's only good to be trampled under feet. That it's possible for the salt of the earth to lose that and become maranthe, useless, empty, worthless. See, it's so critical that we understand this call. Remember, we've got this vision laid over us, right? This vision that we're a force of heaven, that we are participants in the divine nature, that we are being transformed day by day into the likeness of Jesus himself. But if we lose our saltiness, if we lose that, then we're good for nothing. There's a Sir David McNee, who was for a long period of time the chief of police in London. And he was speaking at a conference of police chiefs in the United States. And he said, I want to read you something that we give as a question to new recruits to see how they process crime scenes and how they deal with trouble and struggle and anxiety. And said, this is one of the questions on our police test. You are on patrol when an explosion occurs on the next street. Upon investigating, you find a large hole in an overturned van lying nearby. Inside the van, there is a strong smell of alcohol. Both occupants, a man and a woman, are injured. You know he is an unlicensed driver, and his passenger is the wife of your superior. A motorist stops to assist, and you recognize him as a felon wanted in an armed robbery. Suddenly, another man runs out of a nearby house, shouting that his wife is having a baby. At that moment, you hear someone crying for help. You find a man who has been blown into an adjacent canal by the explosion, and he cannot swim. Describe in a few words what you would do. And he said, my favorite answer of all times was one cadet said this: remove uniform and mingle with the crowd. Right? That's a time to quit. Well, that may be okay if you're a police recruit in London, right? But that's not good for us, right? We got a world that desperately needs the grace of God, that desperately needs hope, that desperately needs all the things that God pours into our lives every day. We can't remove our uniform and mingle with the crowd. That is the salt losing its saltiness. It's removing your uniform and mingling with the crowd. I once heard about a boy riding home with his mother after church service, and she said, you know, the preacher said some things today that confused me, which that happens all the time, doesn't it? Right? So they confused me. Well, what confused you, son? And he said, well, the preacher said that God lives inside us. And she goes, yes, that's right. God lives inside us. And he said, but he also said that God is bigger than us. And she said, yeah, that's right. Oh, God is vast. He's more vast than the whole universe. He is much bigger than us. And the little boy said, but if God is bigger than us and he lives inside us, wouldn't he show through? Wow. Yeah. If God is bigger than us and he lives inside us, wouldn't he show through? You are the salt of the earth. In you lives the power and presence and purpose of Almighty God. And we are called to recognize that every day. The second thing about salt and light: God has empowered me for a life that reflects his glory. God has empowered me for a life that reflects his glory. Let's read the first part of verse 14. You are the light of the world. Now that's, the more you think about that statement, the more amazing it sounds, right? You are the light of the world. It sounds amazing, mostly in light of what Jesus says in this next passage. Let's read this together in John 8. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Wait a minute. Is he the light of the world, or are we the light of the world, right? He says, I'm the light of the world, and then he turns around and says, you are the light of the world. See, our lives are intended to reflect so perfectly the light of God that he can turn and say, this is the light of the world. You're the light of the world here. How many of you are morning people? Raise your hand. We need to keep a close eye on these people, don't we? Right? They've got to be watched closely. But one thing they can tell you that you may not know, the rest of you, that sometimes when the sun is coming up, you can still see the moon. Have you ever seen that? That you got the sun coming up over here and you can still see the moon. I remember one time in southern Africa, there was a moon. It was massive. at sunrise. It looked like the entire, because there's the moon, what they call the lunar illusion, where you see the moon huge. It looks so big. And it seemed to be the whole horizon here on this side as the sun was rising. But really, there's only one light there, right? There's just one light. It's just the sun. And the moon just reflects the light of the sun. Well, that's the picture of our lives, being the light of the world. We are the ones who reflect the light of God. People should be able to see the undeniable reflection of the light of God in our lives. Let's go on in verses 14 and 15. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. They used to build cities one on top of another. And that's how archaeologists know where to dig in certain locales. They'll see a mound and they'll think, well, that's one city, then another city, then another city. Jesus is referencing these cities are built on a hill. They are high, and that's where you do it so the light can be seen. I don't know how many of you have flown into the Oklahoma City airport. Probably many of you, maybe most of you, right? If you're flying in late at night, you see this vast expanse of darkness, and then all of a sudden you see this explosion of light, right? The whole metro area all lit up. And that's the sort of thing that Jesus is talking about here. But he says that you don't hide that kind of light, right? And you don't light a light and then put it under a bowl. That's ridiculous. Who would do such a thing? Who would do something like that? You take your light and you put it on the stand. You want that light to be seen. You are the light of the world, reflecting Jesus, the light of the world. That's not something to be hidden. That's not something that you put away, because God has empowered us with a life that reflects his glory. It reflects his glory. I remember in the famine in Ethiopia in 1985, devastating year 1985. We lost 1 million people to starvation and famine-related causes in that year. There were a number of months we were burying 7,000 people a day. I mean, it was a monstrous famine. It was a terrible time. And we had feeding centers in 3 parts of the country, feeding 30, 40,000 people in each of those that had just wandered in out of the wilderness to receive food aid. And there was one in central Shoa province, and we had hired a particular nurse who was an absolutely fantastic nurse. I mean, she could handle the rigors of 30, 40,000 refugees in a camp like that. I mean, she was doing amazing work, just tremendous work. So full of love, so full of Jesus' compassion. She spoke it. You saw it in her eyes. You saw it in her life. And she worked her 18-hour days tirelessly, just dealing with this incredible loss of life and need around her. And one night I was talking to her about her faith and her background. And she said, I was a scrub nurse in an ER or in a surgery unit. And she said, I became a Christian when the surgeon that I used to scrub for became a Christian. And he changed so dramatically. His life was nothing like it was before. And she said, there was such a light in him that I just had to have that for myself. I had to know what that was about, and that transformed my life. And then you see what God did with her. He moves her over. She's doing this amazing work. But see, you don't put that light under a bowl. You don't hide that light away. You don't think, well, we'll shine the light tomorrow, or maybe later this afternoon, or maybe we can use the light some other time. No, that light is the hope of the world. And Jesus says, you are the light of the world. You reflect that light to others. And God has called us and equipped us and made us ready to be the reflection of his glory. Then the third thing about a life of impact is that God has handcrafted me for a life that demands an explanation. He has handcrafted me for a life that demands an explanation. You should have Matthew 5:16 there. Let's read that together. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father who is in heaven. See, we talked about this verse last week. Let's look at it again, 2 Corinthians 4:7. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Circle the words all-surpassing. All-surpassing, in Greek, hyperbole. We get our word hyperbole from, that's hyperbole, right? And what does hyperbole mean? Exaggerated beyond imagination, right? This unthinkable thing. The word literally means hupo, to throw, and bole, beyond. Those are the two roots. It means so far thrown, so far beyond reality and anything that could possibly happen. It's hyperbolic. It's stretched out of proportion. And he says that all-surpassing power is inside of us. And it's inside our jars of clay, our earthen vessels, some of the translations say, so that they'll see that the all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Now, I'm not talking about a perfect people here, right? I mean, we know who we are. We are not perfect people, but we are people submitted to God and being transformed, right? Some of the most selfish people, this is Selfishness Anonymous today, right? I'm Kevin and I'm selfish, right? That's it. Some of the most selfish people on the earth in the natural, right? And yet we are expecting and waiting and longing and participating with God as he changes that, as he makes that something different, as he replaces our selfishness with the selfless sacrifice of Jesus, right? That's the process we're in. And as that happens, people should notice and say, not you. You're not that loving. I know you. I've been around you for 30 years. You are not a forgiving person. You are not a loving person. You are not a compassionate person. You are not a you go before me, I'll come after you kind of person. What in the world is going on in your life? Because that is not you. See, that's God's plan. That's what he planned. So that people look at you being transformed day by day with greater degrees of accuracy into his likeness, with greater degrees of glory, so that they will notice and they will say, this demands an explanation. Do you remember the story in John chapter 11 about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead? You remember the story, right? He gets a call from Martha, and she says, look, Lazarus is sick. He's going to die. And the text says, or I love what the text says. It said, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so he remained where he was for 2 more days. Wait a minute. They said, send the ambulance, right? They said, air vac, you're going to need the helicopter. Get here as quick as you can because your friend Lazarus is dying. And the text says, he loved them. And because he did, he waited 2 more days to go. Well, so you can imagine how Martha felt when he got there, right? He shows up there, and Martha comes out and says, Lord, if you had come, if you had been here, if you had gotten at least in the ambulance, if not the helicopter, and gotten here, then my brother would not have died. And you remember what he says to her? Your brother will live again. He will rise. And then Martha says, I know. I went to Sunday school. I get it. The last day, we all rise. I understand all the Sunday school stuff. And Jesus says to her, no, you don't understand, because I am resurrection. That's what he tells her, right? I'm resurrection. We're not talking about the last days. I am resurrection. And then he goes, remember the dramatic story? They gather there, they go by the tomb, and he asks them to roll the stone away. And they roll the stone away, and then in verse 41 of chapter 11, Jesus prays. Now, this is how we might have prayed if we'd have been in Jesus' place. Okay, God, you see they rolled the stone away. You see that? The stone is rolled away, and all the people are here, and they're all watching, so please make this happen. But that's not how Jesus prays, right? What does he say? Father, I thank you that this is a done deal. That's what he says, right? I thank you this is already done. And that's it. And then he says the words, Lazarus, come forth. Now, Charles Spurgeon, the 19th century London preacher, said he had to say Lazarus or all the dead people would have gotten up, right? I love that thought. He had to say Lazarus because I just want this one, all right? The rest of you stay where you are. Nobody else move. This is just for Lazarus here. Lazarus, you come on out. The rest of you stay. So that's what happens, right? And so this amazing scene, just imagine this scene, right? And then this next passage. Look at your outline there. The next passage, John 12, verse 9. Let's read it together. Meanwhile, a large crowd followed or found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Wait a minute. Not only to see the Son of God, the guy who'd walked on water and changed water to wine, and the one who stopped the storm, the one who was raising the dead, the one who was healing the sick everywhere he went, not just to see him, not just to see the Son of God, no! They came also to see little old Lazarus. Now, where do you think this was? This was Bethany. Do you know where Lazarus was born and grew up? Bethany. You know who was old news in Bethany? Lazarus. Right? He probably threw parties and people didn't even RSVP. Nobody cared about Lazarus. Who wants to see Lazarus? We've seen Lazarus every day of our lives. But all of a sudden, they come not just to see the Son of God, the creator of the universe in the flesh. They come to see little old Lazarus too. Now, why did they do that? Because his life demanded an explanation, right? Here's a dead guy who's alive. And we really need someone to explain that to us. See, I think we are the Lazaruses of today, aren't we? Isn't that how God sees it? Raised us up, raised against all odds, transformed in ways unimaginable day by day. We're the Lazaruses that people have to come to see because our lives demand an explanation. That's how you interpret these verses, right? That our light shines so that they might see this and glorify our Father is in heaven. This treasure is in earthen vessels, clay pots, so that they might know that it's God who's been at work. See, that's what our lives are supposed to be about. That we are so transformed, so changed, that our lives demand an explanation. They see our lives and they glorify our God in heaven. Boy, that's the call, isn't it? That's the call on our lives. That you live a life today so full of the salt and light and glory and wonder and presence and power of God that everybody around you needs an explanation for that. That your life demands an explanation. Let's bow together in prayer. God, we praise you for these simple words here that tell us so much about your heart and your heart toward our lives. And Father, we want to be salt. We want to be the preserving agents and the purifying agents and the ones who produce thirst the way salt does, God. We want to be those people, and we don't want to take off our uniform and mingle with the crowd, but Father, be used by you in unimaginable ways this very day. Thank you for bringing that kind of power and potential to this ordinary May 23rd of a day. And God, we want to be light. We want to reflect your glory, accurately reflect your glory. We want to be people like the nurse told me in Ethiopia. I used to scrub with this guy. He came to faith. He's now so different. I had to know what happens. And we want to be a people whose lives so shine with your glory, with such a clear sense of your fingerprints on every aspect of our lives, that our lives every day demand an explanation. May that be true, God, in us. We know you've come ready to make it happen today. That is your dream. That is your desire, that we live out this astounding destiny you have laid out for us. May we have the courage and the strength and the faith to reach our hand to you and walk into that life this day. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.